And I do have announcements to make, so bear with me a little bit. First of all, as all of you know, this is our last night of our Lincoln Scholar Series. See, you guys have been a hit. This has been a lot of fun, and I have to tell you, way less stressful than covering religion or the Middle East. So that's my personal interjection. Please join me in thanking our 3 series sponsors who have been a part of this. Hither Green for the site location. Thank you, guys. The Lincoln Society. Show of hands, Lincoln Society members. Every night of the series for broadcast on the Cable Council and other stuff. I'll get to that in a minute. And Wright State's Print Shop. All of the printed materials, all of those came from Wright State, and I'm thrilled. Now, what in the world have they been doing with all of these tapes, and what are we going to do about it so that you guys can find it if you live in Cincinnati or whatever? Well, I tried. I mean, it took a little bit of time, but I do have handouts on the back table. It's all more than you ever wanted to know on how to find the series broadcast online. And there are a couple of things to let you know. First of all, every night is being taped. They're doing the last one now for showing on both Time Warner and AT&T, the cable providers, not regular satellite, but Time Warner and AT&T. Also, streaming video so that you can watch it from Cincinnati, no matter who your cable provider is, or if you want to just look at it from your home computer or from work or whatever. Also on streaming video. The directions on how to find that are on the handout. In addition to that, all of the nights will be showing up on the Cable Council schedule. A set of the entire DVD set will be available in Hither Green's collection and in the library's collection. And the common name for all of this stuff is Lincoln Scholar Series. So if you look Lincoln Scholar Series, you should be able to find any of it. And what if you want to watch it 6 months from now and you don't have a library card, or you live in Cincinnati or whatever? As best I understand, we will be able, we haven't tried it yet, this is experimental, a new one for the library, uploading all of these to YouTube. On our main page of our homepage of our website, we have a YouTube little icon. You click on that, it takes you to the library's YouTube postings, and you can scroll for Lincoln Scholar Series, so that then you could watch it from your home computer with your granddaughter or whatever. So that's an option, but that's the most experimental. And that's going to be a new one because we've never done hour-and-a-half streaming videos before, and they tell us we should be able to, but you really don't know until you try. Please, if you haven't done so, and I'm required to, but it's great to do anyway, our 3 national sponsors have made all of this possible because of the traveling exhibit on Lincoln. That would be the American Library Association, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the United States Constitution Center. If you are so inclined, on the back table, I do have our federal legislators, representatives, with ways to contact them. They would love to hear from you on whether you think this was a waste of money. Please don't spend money on programs like this. Or if you think that this was good, because direct feedback from the public on something that they know they vote on can help. And to tell you the truth, we wouldn't have been able to do this series or the exhibit without those national funders. And aside from that, let's move on to tonight's program. Our moderator tonight is Rick Lewis. He's the education coordinator, and he's got a lot of other names afterwards, but he works full-time here at Hither Green. He's been my go-to guy on every year that we have been doing these, helping me with any of the logistics necessary, and he's just an all-around neat guy. So Rick is our moderator tonight, and I will pass it on to him.
Just a couple things before we get into the questions. If you didn't hear me, we're not taking questions live from the floor. If you have a question, Debbie or Sue will have note cards. You can hand them in, and we'll read them to the panel from there. We have a stamp display on display through the end of this week that one of our members who's here tonight, Robert Hippest-Bunt, has put together. stamped in history from the Revolutionary War up to the Civil War. Very interesting. And Bob and Bernita Daly have graciously brought in a framed poster that they had signed by Carl Westmoreland. And it's on display out by our literature table. All of the handouts from the previous weeks are out there if you'd like to pick those up. I'd like to introduce the panel to you tonight. If you haven't been here for all of the other series, Rich Cooper from the National Museum of the Underground Railroad, Carl Westmoreland, also from there, and Alan Howie, a United Air Force retired colonel and history major, trumpet player extraordinaire, and the Honorable Martin Kingseat, Mayor of Centerville, and a partner at Coolidge Wall Law Firm. Are we good?
I'm gonna put this one over there.
Okay. My very first question, I'm going to address to Mr. Howie, I think, first off, since you did such a great job on the battles. Who were the best generals on either side?
Well. How many hours did you say we had tonight?
We don't have the red-green light system here, so.
Lee's operational and tactical sense, definitely, you have to talk. The way his leadership in his personal style, the men just loved him so much that they would march through hell and back, and even up from Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge for Longstreet's charge. Remember, it's not Pickett's charge, it's Longstreet's charge. They would do anything for him. And if he got too close to the front lines, they would seize his horse by the reins and, lead to the rear, lead to the rear. He could do just about anything. If you take a look at what he did in the summer of 1862 in splitting his army, such audacious leadership, sending Stonewall Jackson around John Pope's Army of Virginia, culminating in the Battle of Second Bull Run or Second Manassas. Then his handling of the tactical situation at the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg. Of course, he had a great assistant in George B. McClellan, the Union commander, who was absolutely so inept. But Lee was able to shuffle troops from one end of the line to another, and always maintain his composure. Then again in the Battle of Fredericksburg and the Battle of Chancellorsville, where he was already outnumbered some 2 to 3 to 1 because Longstreet's corps had been detached over the winter of 1863 and wasn't there at all. And then meeting Joseph Hooker's Union flank attack at the edge of the wilderness at a little hamlet called Chancellorsville, and then splitting his army up and sending Stonewall Jackson around the flank of the Union Army again. Just brilliant tactical and battlefield leadership and situational awareness. Gettysburg was not quite as good, and after that, Lee's army was always on the defensive. But Lee could just about think in the heads of his opponents and get there first. In the Overland Campaign in Virginia in 1864, he would move his troops everywhere General Grant and General Meade seemed to go. And only once was he fooled, and that was when Grant crossed the James River and attacked Petersburg. Only once. Now Grant has been called a butcher and a plotting, dull thinker and everything else, primarily as a result of his battering campaign against Lee in the summer of 1864. But I think that's a mistake. I think Grant had a real tactical and strategic sense about him that rivaled or even surpassed General Lee. If you look at Grant's handling of the Vicksburg campaign, his dogged determination, and his sending the Navy under the guns of Vicksburg, running past the batteries of Vicksburg, and then marching his troops down the western side of the Mississippi, crossing below Vicksburg cutting off of his supply lines, marching to Jackson, defeating a Southern army there under Joseph E. Johnson, excuse me, and then moving back towards Vicksburg. His handling of that campaign was nothing short of brilliant, and the rival of everything that Lee was always lauded for. Sherman had some real bright spots, other generals in turn, but I think Grant and Lee are probably the best, and I really do think that Grant rivals Lee in almost every respect. Any other comments?
No, I agree with that. I think Grant has been underestimated a lot in a lot of the histories, but as Colonel said, I mean, his Vicksburg campaign was absolutely brilliant. I think it'd be very difficult for anyone to match that in terms of the strategic sense and the way that he handled the tactical operations of the Army. Grant had a philosophy that he told a reporter in one of the first days of the Battle of the Wilderness. This fellow had gotten into the Army headquarters and he asked General Grant, well, what is your philosophy? And General Grant said something along the lines of, find out where the enemy is, hit him with everything you've got, and keep going. And that was exactly the right strategy for the Union to follow in 1864. Grant's effort was really to tie Lee's army down, to be in Lee's face constantly, to prevent Lee from making these massive movements that he had been so successful in doing in 1862. And it was an incredibly bloody campaign. But by forcing Lee to deal with the Army of the Potomac day in, day out for 9 months, it prevented Lee from engaging in these types of maneuvers, tied him down to the defense of Richmond, and it allowed General Sherman then to do the carving up of the Confederacy down in the Western Theater. And I think maybe if I can say a few words about William Tecumseh Sherman, who was quite an interesting character. I would think he would have to be one of certainly the trio of Grant, Lee, and Sherman. Sherman's campaign against Joseph Johnson in Georgia to capture Atlanta was really a thing of beauty. He had superior numbers of men, but he maneuvered Johnson out of position after position after position, and he forced Johnson back almost 100 miles from the Chattanooga area to Atlanta. And he lost roughly 30,000 men, which was significant, of course. That was only about half what Grant had lost in battering against Lee in Virginia during the same period. And again, most of what Sherman did was maneuver. He would outflank Johnson, force him to go back. The one time that he did launch a direct attack against Johnson at Kennesaw Mountain, he got a bloody nose. But Sherman learned from that. And then after he captured Atlanta, of course, when he marched to the sea, that just tore the guts out of the Confederacy, because to be able to march through the heart of the Confederacy and do that really made it very plain to anyone who was paying any attention that the South could not defend itself. And I think when Sherman then moved, and this is not as well known because it doesn't get the publicity, but when he moved north from Savannah, when he went through South Carolina and North Carolina in January and February and March of 1865, I mean, and think of this, he was going through swamps. His army was still moving. They were putting roads through swamps, moving north in the depth of a very wet and a cold winter. Joseph E. Johnson actually said that when he learned that Sherman was marching through the swamps of South Carolina at the rate of 10 miles a day, he said that there's not been an army like this since Julius Caesar's time. And so I think Sherman certainly would have to rank up there with the top three, and I think that those three, Lee, Grant, and Sherman, they would be the match for any generals anywhere, in my view.
I agree with that, that's for sure.
I think there was a human element to the trio's military genius, and that was a human relations, if you will, and not particularly for just the sake of goodwill, but ultimately I think it's what allowed the Union to survive to this moment. The way Grant treated Lee and Lee treated Grant, and ultimately the way the men were treated. Sherman, who I don't necessarily like personally, and I don't think he would like me personally, but Sherman was assisted getting through those swamps by people of African descent. They were the scouts. They told them which routes to take. They told them how to ford the water. But let's go back to Grant. Grant received word from Lincoln saying, you're going to use black troops. And they explained why. These people know the land. They've plowed it. They've planted it. They know the trails. And these men rose above their own personal prejudices and their regional dislikes of people of African descent, and frankly set a path for us, just like we did. I was listening to something today where we used Japanese interned people to understand what was going on in World War II when I was a little boy. That's what makes us succeed as Americans. We ultimately come to terms with our differences, and whether we like each other moment to moment or not, we see a larger picture. I think that Grant, Lee, and Sherman helped set a positive example for that.
We had a couple of questions that came from that discussion there. Without General Grant, could the North have won the war?
We sure couldn't have done it with the guy we had. I mean, whoa. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to play tag football. And it was over right tackle, and that's the only way it was going to be. And I think that's what Grant brought to the table, just the willingness to run the risk of dying himself if he would. Pretty much like George Patton in World War II. We had to have a bear on the line.
I think we could have won the war without General Grant, but I think the one indispensable man was Abraham Lincoln. He was the one who kept the war effort going. You know, and if there had not been a Grant, Lincoln would have made one somehow. He would have found one somewhere. It was Lincoln, and that's when I was giving my talk about the great battles. That's why I singled out Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Atlanta campaign, because the three turning points of the war, according to James McPherson, the Civil War historian. Antietam because of the Emancipation Proclamation. That made it almost impossible for England to ever recognize the South and come in to help the South, England being the leading abolitionist nation in Europe. The second turning point, Gettysburg and Antietam, and the reversal of Southern fortunes there, and the cutting of the Trans-Mississippi West, everything west of the Mississippi River, away from the rest of the Confederacy. Very serious setback for the South. But the third, and maybe the most important, was Lincoln's re-election. And that had a lot to do with the battle of the battles around Atlanta in the summer, early fall of 1864. Had Lincoln not been re-elected, I think the South very well might have achieved its goal of independence.
Sure, because McClellan wanted to surrender.
No, I don't think McClellan wanted to surrender, actually, but that was the Democratic platform, the negotiated peace. McClellan George B. McClellan was the Union Army commander early on in the war. He was one of those guys who was a terrific organizer. We would put him in charge of Air Training Command or something like that today, and he would be brilliant there. But he was not a fighter, and he didn't share Lincoln's increasing devotion to a more total objective and subjugation of the South. McClellan was very much against abolition and emancipation. So as the war aims became more total, McClellan became more and more of an anachronism and unsuited for the times. Plus, he simply didn't like to fight. He simply didn't like to fight. He wanted what the military strategists of the day would call a Jominian war of maneuver. Antoine Jomini was a disciple of Napoleon and wrote many, many treatises on strategy and how to win wars. But he based it all on Napoleon. And he based probably on a misreading of Napoleon. Instead of destroying the enemy army, he wanted to capture positions. And McClellan had a wonderful strategic outlook in the early part of 1862 about capturing important railheads. Richmond was one, Petersburg was another, Corinth, Mississippi, and so on and so forth. But a lot of these things, without destroying the enemy army, would have been almost superfluous. So I think Lincoln was truly the indispensable man.
On that same point then, do you think Lincoln was more was he more directed by his passion to keep the Union strong, or his personal opinions about slavery?
You want to answer that?
Oh, I'll start out on that. I think Lincoln was a very complex man. I mean, I think he always hated slavery from when he was a young man, but he also understood that slavery was baked into the Constitution. And I think until he got into the war itself, he was willing to acquiesce in that. I mean, if acquiescing in slavery, with slavery in the South, was the price of keeping the Union together, that's a price that Abraham Lincoln was willing to pay before the war. Once the war began and once the South seceded, I think President Lincoln pretty quickly got to the point of getting back to his basic principle that he thought slavery was an abomination. He also understood just tactically that having an Emancipation Proclamation and freeing the slaves would be the death blow to the Confederacy. It would take away their workforce. It would make it impossible for the Southern armies to stay in the field. And so I think President Lincoln used the crisis of the Civil War to destroy slavery, both because he thought slavery was a violation of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, but also because he knew that as a tactical weapon to use against the seceding states, it was something that was very effective. But I think both motives, the overall opposition to slavery, I think that was always part of Abraham Lincoln's personality.
I would agree with that. And I think that the thing to understand about Lincoln and the Civil War and slavery is Lincoln definitely played a major role in leading us to the end of slavery, but there were probably four main reasons why slavery came to an end through the war. One was Abraham Lincoln himself. Two would be when and where we were at in the war, meaning places like Antietam and the change in the war and the mood within the North and in the South. Three would be different war policies that were passed, like the Confiscation Acts and the Emancipation Proclamation. And then the fourth major reason would be enslaved people getting up off the plantation and leaving. I think one general that we didn't mention early on was General Butler, and I think he played a major role in everything early on with 4th and Row and allowing for African Americans to come into the fort. So I think there are major things that we have to look at with the war and why freedom comes. But Lincoln was definitely at the heart of that and pushing, as the war moved on, trying to push that agenda forward.
I think our state has abandoned Grant. And he had a better record as a human being and as a soldier, as you've heard, and outflanked us on that one. Robert E. Lee was probably the best soldier at the time on the planet. I won't argue that. But I will argue that Grant was not as inept and was not as buffoonish as people would paint him. And I think he suffered at the expense of the South's effective way of winning the war once the shooting was over. And if you look at Grant's human rights record after the war, where he went into Mississippi and he went elsewhere to guarantee people of African descent the right to vote, the right to go to school. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us, having risen to the point where our democracy for the longest has been admired by other people, and at this point we're questioning those values, but they matter. And so these things are linked. And as you've talked about Lincoln's not being always as aggressive as he could have been about race or class or whatever, look at John Kennedy or look at Lyndon Baines Johnson or Everett Dirksen for that matter in our century. I think all politicians and all social advocates and political advocates are also blessed with, the good ones are blessed with a good sense of timing.
Going back to battlefields, did Lee fail at Gettysburg because he stopped listening to Longstreet?
I think I can talk about that one. There are Southern historians who blame Longstreet for the entire loss of the war because Longstreet single-handedly lost Gettysburg and so on and so forth. In fact, he had a great number of detractors who founded the Southern Historical Society after the war. One was his old colleague Jubal Early, who just trashed Longstreet's memory. One of the problems was that, you see, Longstreet became a Republican after the war, and he was an old personal friend of Grant. So, of course, Longstreet was made a scapegoat for many things. No, I think Longstreet did commit the unpardonable sin of being right with regards to Gettysburg, but I think Lee could not have done anything differently. What Longstreet wanted Lee to do at Gettysburg was not attack, but to receive attack. Longstreet understood the power of the tactical defense during the Civil War with the new rifled musket that increased the lethal ground in front of a defender about 3 to 5 times greater than it had been during the Mexican War. In the Mexican War, you could get your line of battle out there with bayonets and get one shot in those smoothbore muskets. You could approach within about 50 yards of the opposite line and fire and then run and charge and stab everything in sight. In the Civil War, that didn't work. They tried it. You know, their nice long lines, elbow to elbow, basically a wall of men marching towards a defended position. But this time, instead of 50 yards, they had to cross up to 500 yards of deadly ground. Now, most soldiers couldn't hit the broadside of a barn at 500 yards, but they could start hitting things around 100 to 200 yards, especially if they just pointed their rifles in the general direction. Remember, this is a wall of people. So Longstreet understood better than most Civil War generals, North and South, the power of the tactical defense. So what he wanted Lee to do was not attack at Gettysburg, not attack this high ground, which isn't very high, by the way. You know, every time I drive out to give music lessons out in Farmersville or Germantown, I go over ridges that are every bit as high as Cemetery Ridge and Seminary Ridge. These, you know, greatly defended positions. These are not tall ridges by any stretch of the imagination, but they did have clear fields of fire in front of them. So Longstreet wanted to move the Confederate Army away from Gettysburg and move somewhere in between Gettysburg and Washington, D.C. That would force the Federal Army to attack them on ground that the Confederates chose that would have this field of fire. Longstreet learned this at Fredericksburg, where the Union Army just dashed itself suicidally against Confederate defenses. Well, Lee couldn't do that for a couple of reasons. Logistically, he didn't have the right stuff to do it. I mean, he didn't have a rail line stretching back into Virginia. He could maybe live off the land for a while, but when an army lives off the land, like Sherman did in the March to the Sea, I'm sure some of you have heard the famous words of the song, Marching Through Georgia, 60 miles in latitude, 300 to the main. Here's 50,000 guys in Sherman's army stretched out 60 miles wide. Was that so they could just cut a swath of destruction? Partially. But it was to provide food for themselves. An army that's concentrated cannot forage for food. So if Lee had taken Longstreet's advice and moved the army and put it in one place between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, D.C., he would have eliminated his possibility to forage, one. Two, he would have cut off all of his supply lines back to Virginia. And even if you can't forage for food, you can't forage for ammunition and cannonballs and things like that, right? And then, what would the Union Army have to do except just basically surround the Confederates and starve them out? They wouldn't even have to attack. So Longstreet had the right tactical idea, but he had the wrong strategic sense. Lee could not do what Longstreet wanted him to do. And Lee, having such faith in the Army of Northern Virginia that he did, he was overconfident, and this was his mistake. He thought they could do anything, and that led to Pickett's Longstreet's charge.
Well, I just wanted to say, because sometimes there's so much mythology about Lee, and he was a great general, there's no doubt about that. But sometimes when people analyze, well, gosh, how could he possibly have lost the Battle of Gettysburg, they forget that the Union Army was there too.
They were a contributing force, weren't they?
They were a contributing force. And the fact is, the Union Army at Gettysburg fought extremely well. Meade's subordinate commanders, for the most part, there were exceptions. Sickles
yeah.
kind of
Sickles.
marched out too far, but for the most part, Reynolds and Hancock and some of the other corps commanders did a magnificent job. And the Union soldiers themselves fought in a very brave way. They didn't break. They just fought in a magnificent way. So again, I think we need to remember that. Lee obviously made some mistakes at Gettysburg. Every general, I think, in every battle makes mistakes. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the contest between the individuals in the two armies. And at Gettysburg, Meade's soldiers and his subordinate commanders served him very well. Lee, some of Lee's subordinate commanders didn't serve him as well. I think the men on both sides fought magnificently, but at the end of the day, the Union Army prevailed. But again, that wasn't just a fluke, and it wasn't just because Lee made mistakes.
Gettysburg was a linchpin. If you remember, the draft riots occurred in New York same month.
Mm-hmm.
All right? And the Irish made it clear they weren't going, they just gotten here and they said, what do we have to do with this? The same year, African American troops went to Fort Wagner. And they did what this gentleman has described so adequately. They tried to go point blank. And they did get into Fort Wagner twice. They paid for it. But then we found out, which also gave Lee a problem, a headache, that now they had additional people who were willing to fight. And if anybody failed, it was the Southern legislators at Richmond that wouldn't give Lee black troops. Black troops, black people built Fort Monroe, and I can go on. They built the fort in Charleston. They knew the land. They could have been leading Confederate troops rather than helping Sherman get through the Carolinas. So Gettysburg really mattered. Antietam in '62 and Gettysburg in '63.
On the same vein then of that subject, then what was the greatest role of blacks in winning the Civil War, both as soldiers and as civilians?
The greatest contribution we made was two. We had more to lose than anyone else. We had every reason to die. Frederick Douglass had this famous poster. He not only encouraged people of African descent to join the Union, but to die for the Union. Go die so that they'll respect you. And at Vicksburg, at Fort Wagner, at Aloste in Florida. There were a lot of those battles we didn't win, but we wouldn't stop coming. And there was a unit in North Carolina who defended Fort Wagner. And they talked about the men from the Massachusetts 54th continuing the charge. And they said, we just kept killing them and they wouldn't stop coming. And the one man who was interviewed, he said, but they had everything to die for. And that is what made the difference. And then we knew the land. We helped with the foraging. We had everything to prove in that we not only no one respected us, but we even doubted ourselves. And for example, at Fort Nelson in Kentucky, black men were literally leaving the ranks and going home and getting their wives away from the plantations and getting their children so that they could be secure while they went to go die. And so it was an act of organized desperation. And it was, I think, something that people of all backgrounds would do ultimately. And this provided the first opportunity they'd ever had since the Revolutionary War, when they joined Dunmore and fought for the British. We don't talk about that in public. The Brits offered emancipation to blacks in Virginia. And their descendants are now in Nova Scotia and in Sierra Leone. We've been waiting that long for another opportunity.
And I think that as the Civil War began, I think African Americans across the North and the South knew this was their moment. There is David Blight from Yale University, in one of his books, and I can get the name of it here in a minute, starts off with, in Charleston, South Carolina in 1865, there was a major battle there, and a number of Union soldiers were buried in very shallow graves. And after the war, African Americans in the community and pastors go and dig those bodies up and then give them a better burial. They hold these ceremonies, and on the way out to the ceremonies, they actually have a parade. And in this parade, they have two floats. The first float was a coffin, and it said Fort Sumter, 1861. The second float was a slave auction taking place. And what African Americans were showing was, hey, this was the cause of this great war, and this was our opportunity, and we knew that we were going to step up and help. They, in the summer of 1862, right down the road from here, in Cincinnati, the siege of Cincinnati, African Americans start to form regiments known as the Black Brigade of Cincinnati. I kind of talked about that a little bit in week 2, but all the way from 1861, when Fort Sumter is fired on, African Americans all across the North, and Boston, Cleveland, Cincinnati, New York, they started to form home guards, saying, hey, they want to be involved in this too. They want to step up and show that, hey, this is our time to become citizens. So they're starting to form these home guards. Well, people push back and say, this is a white man's war, we want you to stay out of it. So they kind of dispense to kind of save their families. And in the summer of 1862, when the Confederate troops start pushing up towards Cincinnati, they actually get within a mile in South Covington. And there's a call that goes out by Lew Wallace, who wrote the poem or the book.
Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur, slipping my mind, slipping me, sorry. Thank you. But he puts out a call, martial law, and says that everyone needs to report. Well, African Americans go and say, hey, what does this mean for us? Because in the newspapers it says all alien citizens, blah, 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 should report, but you need to report to your respective place of voting. African Americans weren't allowed to vote. Well, there was a decision that was made that they would force African Americans to serve. So from September 2nd to September 4th, 1862, African Americans were rounded up off the streets. Their houses were searched, their cellars, bayonets were shoved through the bedding. They were kidnapped off the streets. About 400 African Americans went through this and were taken into Kentucky, which as a free African American, if you were taken into the state of Kentucky, you were technically no longer free. You could be re-enslaved. Well, that goes on until September 4th, when Judge Dixon, who is a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, when Abraham Lincoln comes to the area, he goes to Dixon's house. Eventually, he's able to talk Lew Wallace into allowing the African Americans to go home. They go home that evening of September 4th. He says, hey, I want you to come back and volunteer. As I said, all 400 of them were captured. Well, 700 of them show up the next morning to go into Kentucky to build forts and to build the roads and tear down trees to protect the city of Cincinnati against an invasion. So African Americans were ready. This was like the first, they were never truly mustered in, and they fight, we actually have at the Freedom Center from the National Archives, all the way up until 1901 are they fighting the federal government for pensions. White squirrel hunters that came down and answered the call to protect city of Cincinnati also. The state of Ohio did provide them a pension of about, and it was somewhere between $100, I believe. I might be misquoting that, but it was a good amount of for them to come down. African Americans were paid on the second and third week of that. On September 20th, the Confederate troops pushed away, and the black troops, or the blacks troops that were there in Kentucky come back. They're celebrated. It's one of the first times in Cincinnati that you saw all of the community coming together and celebrating. Now, the next day it went back to normal, but people were celebrating. It showed the hope for the future. A lot of them went on to fight in the 54th Massachusetts. A lot of them went on to fight in the Navy. A lot of them went on to fight in the Ohio regiment that formed actually up in Delaware. One of them was Powhatan Beatty, who went on to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. One of them was Peter Fawcett, who was a great nephew of Sally Hemings. There were school teachers, there were barbers, there were doctors, there was people that riverboatsmen. They made up a whole diverse part of the city. But what it showed was African Americans were ready to go and fight to show that, hey, that they belonged as citizens inside the United States, and this was their opportunity.
I'd like to follow on a little bit to that too. Overall, roughly 179 to 180,000 African Americans served in the Northern Army. And they served, in combat, and they served in support roles, and just everything that you can imagine. But every African American soldier in the Northern Army is one less on the Southern plantations, because about 90% of them were escaped slaves. And when the Northern Army penetrated Southern territory, African Americans would flock to the Army and follow that Army. I think probably that as Sherman was marching to the sea, he probably had as many African Americans following along than he had soldiers in the ranks. So everything that the Union Army gained from African American participation, the Confederacy lost. Now, the Confederacy did use African Americans too. They impressed slaves to build field works and fortifications. In fact, during the Atlanta campaign, as the Confederates fell back from one position to the next, they fell back to previously prepared positions, trenches and earthworks and fortifications that were dug and built by impressed slaves. So it was a great manpower advantage to the North and a great manpower disadvantage to the South as those African Americans got away and got to wear their suits of blue.
And I serve on 2 commissions for the Ohio 150 Commission here for the state of Ohio. I'm also on the National Advisory Board for the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And this is a question that comes up significantly about the role of African Americans. One piece that people will often bring up is, well, there were African Americans that fought for the Confederacy. And it's an argument that continues to go on. Were there African Americans that fought for the Confederacy? Yes. However, it was very, very small amount of people. The other thing about it is a lot of them were impressed. And what I mean by that is if somebody held my family on the plantation and was telling me what to do, in most cases, enslaved Africans were doing that work, and they really had no say in that decision. So that is something, that's one of those other, it did happen, but one of those large myths that have grown out of the Civil War, that were a significant amount of African Americans fought in the war. If you go through the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, at the very end of the museum, you really have to look for it. There's actually 2 documents on the wall. And one of the documents actually shows where the South is finally, in the late 1865, is going to allow African Americans to serve, to fight for the Confederacy. So they were really starting to say that, hey, this was a significant disadvantage for them to not allow this to happen.
If you'd look, and I'll stop quickly.
Too little, too late.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at Plymouth, North Carolina, it's in Washington County. It empties into the Albemarle Sound. It was and still is a predominantly black county. 1863, 1864, the Union Army had 5,000 troops there. 3,500 of them in that county were African Americans who had been enslaved 60 days before the Union showed up. And they said, give me a blue and give me a gun. And their great-grandsons are walking around there still. And they're just beginning within the community to celebrate it. But the most beautiful thing is it's as a result of meetings like the ones in which you are participating at this very moment. They've come to terms with a historical truth, and this whole thing's been put together with a 70-year-old Duke University graduate who must have been a hippie back in the day, because he's white and he wears his baseball cap backward. It's a riot. But he's pulled out all these pictures and all these drawings, and I was there a month ago, and they had the reenactors of the white and the black troops, all from the same county, fighting each other. It's a historical truth.
I don't know whether the questions are really good or the discussions leading into the questions are really well. Were there significant numbers of Northerners who went south to fight and vice versa, Southerners who came north?
No, I didn't. I was just remarking that my great uncle was a Plymouth Pilgrim. He was in the 12th New York Cavalry, and he was captured at the Battle of Plymouth in 1864 and sent to Andersonville. So I'm sorry, would you repeat the question? My fault.
Were there significant numbers of Southerners that came to fight for the North, and likewise Northerners that went to fight for the South?
They were called galvanized Yankees, a lot of them. Yeah, there were some, you know. The whole idea of the brother against brother war, if you were in the deepest, most southern part of Alabama, or the most northern part of Vermont, there's probably not a whole lot of brother against brother there. But if you're from a border state, good golly. You know, I think it was at the Battle of Gettysburg that a regiment of Union Maryland troops on Culp's Hill met a regiment of Confederate Maryland troops. And that did occur, most certainly. And there were certainly isolated instances of brother against brother in other parts of the country. But it was more and more prevalent in the border states. There's a great story of near Charleston, South Carolina. There's a historical building there, one of the old plantation houses named Drayton Hall. And in the Drayton family, there were 2 sons. One, I think it was Percival Drayton, became a Union admiral. And I think it was Thomas Drayton, who was a Confederate general. And it just so happened that the Union Navy Drayton shelled the Confederate Drayton in a fort outside during the campaign around Savannah. So, yeah, these things did occur.
I think also, I mean, there were some pockets in the South where there was more unionist sentiment,
Oh, that's right.
Eastern Tennessee.
Yes.
Northern Alabama?
And there was a section in northern Alabama too where,
And then there was a Western Virginia.
well, West Virginia, of course, yeah. It's a trick question, you know, if they ask you what's the last state to be admitted to the Union east of the Mississippi? Well, it's West Virginia in 1863, I guess.
Right.
So, I mean, there were pockets of what, you know, the Southern Confederate states that did not favor secession. That doesn't necessarily mean that these pockets were favorably inclined to African Americans, but they certainly did not agree that the Union should be severed. And part of the strategy that President Lincoln had, which didn't work all that well militarily, is he kept wanting to send Union armies into eastern Tennessee, which you know is a wonderful place, but I guess it's pretty hard to sustain an army there through the Smoky Mountains. But there were, again, I mean, I think it's exactly right. The brother against brother thing is perhaps overstated in the mythology, but I mean, again, and there were parts of the North, and the whole issue with Copperheads and northern people in the Democratic Party who did not support the war effort, who didn't think that the federal government should try to force the Confederate States back into the Union by force. So it was not a completely, you know, everybody on one side was fighting for the Union and everybody on the other side was in support of the Confederacy. It was much more mixed than that.
The City Council of New York City came within 2 votes of joining the Confederacy. They wanted to. Why? Because they had commercial relations with the South, just as Cincinnati did. Our major source of goods that were produced in Cincinnati was New Orleans, Vicksburg, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, and the same with New York City. So, yeah, we had these schisms within northern communities based on their interest, and there was a split in a lot of the northern communities. So that was a part of the phenomenon. And that made the role of the 3 gentlemen about whom we've been talking so important, because they did not play to those audiences that were, even within their own communities, inclined toward disunion. And we've been the benefactors of that.
Since this was a war within our own borders, how important was the Navy in
The Navy, had they not cut off South Carolina, had they not cut off New Orleans, had they not ultimately prevailed at Vicksburg with the assistance of the Army, of course, had they not been stationed in Cincinnati, we've been in trouble. For example, the invasion of South Carolina just south of Charleston at Beaufort, that set up Port Royal. And just think about it, January 1st, 1863, at Beaufort, 1,000 people of African descent were in burgundy pants because they didn't have bottoms, and they had on their blue Union uniforms, and they invaded Jacksonville, Florida within 30 days, and the Confederates are still running. So they were there long enough to adequately train these people. They also set up the schools at St. Helena. The first black school for people of African descent was created at St. Helena and at Beaufort. And so kind of experience was accorded us that from the Navy. The Navy also was much more integrated than the United States Army. Robert Smalls from Charleston, South Carolina, who captured the Planter and then gave it to the Union, also became a part of the fundraising effort at Mr. Lincoln's request for the Northern Army. But his active duty, he was in 17 battles as a commanding officer for the American Navy. He was African American.
let me say something about the Navy too. You really have to think about the Navy during the Civil War in two different areas. One is the ocean, but the other one is the rivers. And as far as the ocean goes, you had a few Confederate commerce raiders and Union warships chasing them around. That was almost a sideshow. But the blockade, the Union blockade of southern ports at the beginning of the war was only about 10% effective. By about 1865, it was 50% effective. It never really got much higher than that. But that was enough to help contribute to almost 1,700% inflation in the Confederacy, and all kinds of adverse effects of the blockade felt throughout all of Southern society. But I think probably the most important contribution of the Union Navy was on the rivers. Remember, especially in the West, the rivers were avenues of invasion deep into into Confederate territory, and the Navy was always there. The gunboats, either ferrying supplies or troops, or providing direct fire support for Union Army operations. And then on the crossing the rivers, even in Virginia, the Union Army never would have gotten across the James River in the summer of 1864 had it not been for the Union Navy on the river, one, protecting their pontoon bridges from Confederate attack, and two, the current in the James River was too swift for a regular pontoon bridge. So the Union Navy actually anchored a lot of the pontoon bridges. I think there were 3 major bridges with their ships. So without the Navy, they never would have gotten across the river. So especially what we call joint operations between the Army and the Navy today, and the cooperation between individual Army generals and individual Navy commodores and admirals without anyone over them. Unlike today, you have a general or an admiral who's over all the branches of service in that particular theater. That didn't exist in the Civil War. So you had to depend upon personal cooperation between the Navy commander and the Army commander. And in most cases, it worked very, very well.
Harriet Tubman, when she came down from Maryland to South Carolina, General DuPont, the you-know-who family, he was delivering this lady up and down, what's the name of the river and that comes just south of Charleston? But this lady was going on plantations, and you know, she's from the Eastern Shore in Maryland. And even though she wasn't Geechee, she obviously spoke and a form of English that was not English. And she would walk up on a plantation and tell the people, I'm Harriet Tubman, and the Navy brought me here to tell you you are free. And you know, folks were getting their stuff, and again, the man couldn't pick cotton, they couldn't harvest, and all of a sudden, and so, but the Navy was delivering people like her behind the lines to help change the balance of power.
For Alan, how important was City Point Railroad behind hospital? I'm not sure I understand the question on this one. For
3 things.
You're asking about the Union headquarters during the siege of Petersburg at City Point.
Railroad and the hospital.
Well, the City Point was where Grant had his headquarters during the siege of Petersburg in the summer of 1864, once the Union Army had crossed the James River. City Point was a hub of all their resupply efforts. The Navy would bring in all kinds of resupplies, dock at City Point. I've seen pictures of it, all these ships, you know, docked at City Point. And there was a City Point Railroad. And the Army used that railroad and expanded upon it to bring supplies from the wharf on the shoreline, the banks of the river, all the way up to the Union positions around Petersburg. And the City Point Hospital, I don't know anything in particular about the City Point Hospital except that it was very large, and it was a processing point to put wounded soldiers on ships to go back up to Washington to the greater hospital complexes around the Washington D.C. area. Does that answer your question at all? It was very vital.
Well, essentially, Lee didn't have it, his supplies were gone, the Union Army had.
Well, Lee, during the siege of Petersburg, still had a couple of railroads open to him, and one of Grant's objectives during the siege of Petersburg was to extend his lines further to the west. And each time he did so, the purpose of that extension of the lines was primarily to break a major road, like the Boyden Plank Road, or a railroad, like the South Side Railroad. And the reason that Petersburg was important in the first place was that there were about 3 or 4 railroads that met in Petersburg, and then there was a railroad that connected Petersburg with Richmond. Once Petersburg was cut off, then Richmond would have to fall. So Grant kept cutting these railroad lines, and finally when they got to the South Side Railroad, that was the last railroad, and Lee had to abandon the position, and Jefferson Davis and what was left of the Confederate government had to flee. That occurred on the 2nd of April, 1865, and Lee surrendered at Appomattox exactly 1 week later.
I'm going to combine some questions that are similar in nature. One is that it says an article in the New York Times questioned the naming of forts in the South for Confederate generals. Some of the generals were not that distinguishable. How does that come about, and how are battlefields chosen for a monument?
For the naming, I think that was an act of genius that helped keep us together as a country. We defeated the South, and the first step that I think one of the most important things that happened was how Grant treated Lee, and then how we continued to follow up on that, because and I'm sure there's Southerners in the room. You know, it's their end of the block. They wanted us to respect it. They wanted us to respect people that they designated as icons. And then remember, most of these men who, and I think you would agree with me, they knew each other. They'd gone to West Point together. They'd fought in Mexico together, and now they were killing each other. But when the killing was over, it's like in my neighborhood. When the basketball game is over or the fight is over, you don't laugh in somebody's face. That leads to the formation of gangs and bitter rivalries that go on until somebody gets killed. So I think that was a wonderful tactic, and I'm very comfortable with it.
I actually, after visiting Memphis, Tennessee, I guess it's now 2-3 years ago, with a group of our docents, each summer we take our volunteer docents on a trip to a different place that relates to the subject area of the Freedom Center as a thank you for their helping us with school groups. And we were in Memphis, and we were traveling around looking at all the different monuments of the period, and I believe that what Mr. Westmoreland said is definitely was important to bringing the nation back together and telling their stories. But I also think there is a myth and an issue with some of the monuments in the South, but also some of the stories that are told. When we were in Memphis, Tennessee, there was actually a celebration for Nathan B. Forrest. Forrest was involved in Fort Pillow and the massacre of African Americans, and he was also a founding member of the KKK. And I struggle with us celebrating people of not saying that what he did in the Civil War or anything like that, or trying to discredit him, but for us to celebrate someone that was involved in those things, I struggle with. I also struggle with, if you go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, there's actually a stone pillar to the death of an African American there, who in many ways they kind of run up as a Confederate sympathizer, like he was running back to tell everybody that Fort Sumter was, or not Fort Sumter, I apologize, Harper's Ferry was being attacked. There was also a big article a couple of years ago in 1860, for the 1861 150th anniversary, someone wrote graffiti on a statue of Robert E. Lee, which I don't believe you should do that kind of stuff. But they wrote something, and I can't remember. I can't remember exactly what it said, but something like liar or something like that. Or so there's some hard feelings around some of the monuments that are in the past. I actually, on the Freedom Center webpage, wrote a blog about what we commemorate and should we commemorate that. I think we should tell the stories of the Civil War, but I also think that we need to be very careful about how those stories are told.
At Donaldsonville, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River, there is an African American museum, and operated by a lady who graduated from the University of Southern California, but grew up in Donaldsonville. And she told me that 5 years ago, the Daughters of the Confederacy erected this big statue. And so the black young men in the community wanted to deface it. And she says, no, we'll build one to the U.S. colored troops that is larger. And she called, she was a funeral director, and she called the company that had been selling gravestones to her father's business for over 50 years. And sure enough, the Confederate monument was 7 foot tall, and the statue to the U.S. colored troops at Donaldsonville, Louisiana, is 8 foot tall. And the point is, they both deal with the truth as we see it.
What is the role of European nations in the Civil War, mainly England and France?
England, as my friend said, England set a course for the rest of the world in the 1830s when they outlawed enslavement, and better yet, they had this public discussion that set the floor. If you look at the drawings you've seen of how enslaved people were stacked in the ships in the transatlantic slave trade, they came from Lloyd's of London, all right? And so it's a documented piece of history that we can't argue with. And the English basically said, we're ashamed of the role that we've played in this, and we're out of it. And they left a legacy that influenced, I think, the abolition movement here in a positive way, not absolutely, but it started, it gave energy to the American abolition movement, and not just to the United States of America, but to North America. France and other countries did not take the English place in the transatlantic slave trade, but people from Boston and Rhode Island and New York City and Jersey City did. That's who took over the slave trade, the American North. The Southerners were not major transporters. So England really made a difference. When the war came along, they sat on the fence. And one of the tactics that really made a difference was the Emancipation Proclamation, and they honestly believed in, as a country, I won't say to the individual, but the government supported abolition, and at that point France and England came in to the North corner, and most importantly, they did not actively as countries, support the Southern cause. South probably would have won had England helped them with shipping, had both of them helped materially.
There's,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, there is a great, we're gonna talk about this later, but there is a great book out there on Britain's war, or Britain's role in the war. It's called A World on Fire. Britain's crucial role in the American Civil War. It's like 1,008 pages, but it is probably the most well-researched book on the role that Britain played in the Civil War. So it is actually more significant than people would tell.
I see my wife out there, when you said 1,000 pages, she's probably thinking, oh my God.
Yes.
He's gonna get that.
Christmas.
Yeah, Christmas. I do think there was, the Confederacy certainly made a very strong pitch and push to get foreign recognition of the Confederacy as a separate nation. And in particular, before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1861 and 1862, the South hoped that England's need for cotton, which of course was the main export of the South, and employed hundreds of thousands of people in Great Britain making clothing and all that sort of thing. The Confederacy hoped that by cotton being cut off, it would put so much economic pressure on Great Britain that the government would recognize the Confederacy and would again try to force a peace between the Union and the Confederate States. And a lot of what President Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward were focusing their attention on as to foreign policy was to prevent that from happening. And it probably was a pretty close run call. I mean, the head of the Second Empire in France, Louis Napoleon, favored the South. I don't know that he favored slavery, but he thought it would be a great idea to break up this large competitive nation that was growing up in the United States. I think the leadership in Great Britain had some of the same thoughts. America obviously was an economic competitor to Great Britain, and if America split in half, that would be of some economic benefit perhaps to Great Britain. But at the end of the day, the President Lincoln made it very clear that if the Great Britain or France intervened, that would be deemed to be an act of war by the United States. And of course, Canada was available, if you will, there, and the British had to be concerned about what the United States would do in terms of taking action against Canada. And the French were not willing to act without Great Britain. And so the President Lincoln kind of danced around this issue for a while, kept the British and the French from intervening. They were waiting to see if the South was going to win, and that's why Antietam was so important, because when Lee's army was turned back, that was a moment when the Great Britain was seriously considering trying to come in and say that both countries, the United States and the southern states, should mediate this. And when Lee was turned back, they decided to put that effort on hold. President Lincoln then went forward with the Emancipation Proclamation, and that did, from a public relations point of view, have a huge impact, because the population in Great Britain was opposed to slavery, and even though Britain was not the kind of democracy or republic the way the United States was, public pressure did have some impact on the government policy. And I think it became politically impossible for the British government to be seen as trying to enforce a peace or to do something that would have been in favor of a slaveholding republic once President Lincoln made it very clear that if the North won, slavery was going to end.
The European powers in particular were very important to the war efforts on both sides. For example, when the war started, there was a very limited supply of rifled muskets in the United States. And so both the Confederate government and the Union government sent agents all over Europe to buy up every available musket, whether it was obsolete or not. And both the Union and Confederate armies fought with British Enfield rifles and Austrian muskets and French this and then Belgian that. So a lot of that went on for resupply. All through the war, the Confederates imported gunpowder and other materials of war from England and France. The Confederates floated loans through the French, kind of a pseudo-French government arrangement called the Erlanger Loan, promising cotton after the war and other staples for cash now to buy more war goods. But the real key player in this whole foreign recognition game was Great Britain, because Great Britain had the Navy that could potentially break the Union blockade of southern ports. Without Great Britain on the side of the Confederacy, France, and even if the other countries of Europe wanted to support the Confederacy, nobody could unless Great Britain took the side of the South.
All right, there's a couple of questions I really want to get to, and then I want to do the wrap-up of future readings and things. One was Lincoln's conviction that slavery was wrong rooted in legal or moral reasons?
You should answer that.
I'll take the first shot at that. I think it was rooted in moral reasons. He made it very plain, even as a young man, that he thought slavery was abhorrent. I mean, that's the term he used. I think he had a moral understanding that owning another human being was just an atrocity. His reluctance to actively campaign against slavery in the South before the war, I think, was based on legal reasons. I mean, again, Lincoln obviously was a lawyer. He thought in a very logical way, and he understood that the Constitution of the United States, the formation of the federal government, was a compromise, and that the compromise accepted slavery in the South. That was the condition that had to be agreed to in order to get the southern states to join the United States in 1789. And so he understood that. He said over and over again, he said in his inaugural address that he did not think that he had the power under the Constitution to impact slavery in the South. But he also said he would not do anything, he would absolutely fight to the death to prevent the expansion of slavery. So I think President Lincoln's opposition to slavery was based on his moral principles, his understanding of the Declaration of Independence, but until the South basically broke the contract, if you will, by seceding, I think President Lincoln understood that he, as the president, the constitutional leader of the United States, did not have the legal power to outlaw slavery in the southern states. But once the South seceded, once the South started the war, then the president used his war powers to say, we're going to take this weapon, these African American men and women who are supporting, are being forced to support the South, we're going to free them as a weapon to use against the South.
I would agree with that. I think it was in the beginning definitely more of the legal side and him understanding that. But as we said, he was a very complex man. And I think that during the war, it became more moral as he met with people like Frederick Douglass and Robert Smalls and Harry Beecher Stowe. If you look at his first inaugural, and obviously he said, I'm not going to let it expand, but he knew he couldn't push that too far to end slavery right away. But then if you look at his second inaugural and how far his words changed, it is amazing. And I do think it plays into the moral side and meeting with formerly enslaved African Americans and truly getting to know who they were, I think really helped change his mindset during the war.
One of the people with whom he met was the gentleman to whom I referred was Robert Smalls, and of course he met Harriet Tubman and other people. And think about where he was from geographically, the kind of community in which he was raised, his social status. He didn't know anything about black people other than at a distance. As the war changed, as the Southern effort became a reality, where they basically said, we're done. We're not a part of the country. And he replied to someone in a letter, he spelled it out. He said, I didn't do this, they did. They broke the contract. And since they broke the contract, I am not obligated by law to help them sustain enslavement. All right? And they're using enslaved people as an asset of war. For example, at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, there were 1,000 enslaved people working there in in what was a gun manufacturing facility. All right? Take that 1,000 people out. They were not only making guns, but these were skilled craftsmen. And they were making guns to shoot Northern soldiers. And so, and at the same time, with his reading, and with him apparently being a very decent human being, he began to see people of African descent differently, just as Harriet Beecher did, because the Beecher family originally were colonizationists. In other words, they didn't agree with enslavement, but they wanted black people to leave. Lincoln that's where he started out. All right? And part of I think the beauty of what we've all been discussing and thinking about is that, and some lady said it to me, Miss Fisher, I don't know where you are, but the older we get, the more we grow, and the more we go back and reread and think. And it allows us to do what he did and what people down through history have done. Come to terms with how we interact with other human beings in a more constructive way.
Okay. There's one quick question, and then I want to get to the reading list for future studies. They have recently revised the number of dead upward. How do they come at this new number?
That, I believe, just went up to 750,000 people in the Civil War instead of the over 620,000. And that comes out of research, and the Freedom Center just quoted some of that on an online blog that we had. That new number, they're saying, it looks at more of the civilian casualties and the African-American casualties in the war. There's some other remote areas that they have. I would like to see kind of more research around that before. Most historians are still agreeing with the 620,000 number, but it has jumped. There's some groups that are saying it is upwards of 750,000 people died.
I got a little insight into that. The older numbers came from two turn-of-the-century studies, late 19th century, early 20th century. William Fox presented his research in 1889, regimental losses in the American Civil War. And in 1900, Thomas Livermore set out to make a more complete account. His book was called Numbers and Losses in the Civil War in America. That's where the older numbers come from. And they went through the documents, muster rolls and reports and things like that to determine the losses. Now this most recent thing, David Hacker, he's a demographic historian from Binghamton University in New York. He took a look at digitized census records from 1860, 1850, and compared it to census records from 1870 and 1880. And he found a whole lot of people missing. and from that, now these are all extrapolations. These are all educated guesses. These are not exact numbers, especially Professor Hacker's numbers. So he's estimating now about 750,000. So that's an increase of about 20%. But that's where that comes from, digitized census records in the last couple of years.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's give our panel a hand. I think they've done a great job. There are a couple of questions that we just don't have in the interest of time, like what is Lincoln's greatest legacy? We need to be out before we open again in the morning, so we'll let that one slide. If you want to talk to them privately, you can do that. I'd like to start from left to right, from your left to right. So start with Rich. Give us a quick list, get your pens and pencils ready, some things we can look at for further study, your best biographies of Lincoln, studies on the Civil War. What's that?
Don't forget, even if we don't own it in our library, we can try to get it for you.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, there are lots of interlibrary loaning and lending also.
And you guys, if you want, you can also email me your selections so that we get it spelled correctly, and then we can try.
Yeah, we'll do that too, but let's just run down the list real quick.
And I will definitely email. We have a big biography of books, but a couple of things I would recommend outside of books that if you have a Mac or an iPod or an iPad, which I know not everybody has, but I will search to find if this is anywhere else on the web. Mac has created this new thing called iTunes U, and on iTunes U there's a history section, and there's a section called Open Yale Courses. So Yale University, and there are 27 lectures from David Blight of the Civil War era, pre-Civil War, all the way through the Civil War, all the way through the Reconstruction. It is amazing. I would also check out the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, and also the Ohio Civil War 150 website, which has a wealth of information on local communities inside the state of Ohio and the Civil War. So those are the 3 areas I will recommend. And I will also send Sue a long biography of books on the war.
Mr. Russell?
The Abolitionist Legacy, written by James McPherson. McPherson creates a bridge from the end of the Civil War to where we're sitting right now. He's a noted Princeton historian. And then there's a wonderful resource by Thomas Morris Chester, the Black Civil War correspondent. And this gentleman grew up in America, but was educated in England before the Civil War. And he was interspersed with black troops in the South and was able to go in and out of black communities. And you had a question about how black people thought or why they were motivated. He talks about it from the ground level. And I see his work being quoted by David Blight and by James McPherson. This is just 2 of them, and I think they will help add to your reading. And as one last thought, you all have been a wonderful audience, and a lot of you are better prepared than we are.
I'd like to recommend, well, there are many single volume biographies of Abraham Lincoln. There are many multiple volume biographies. But this is an older one. This came out in the late 1940s by Benjamin Thomas. Benjamin Thomas, simply entitled Abraham Lincoln. Now there are more recent biographies, but I'm not sure there are any better than Benjamin Thomas's. I'd also like to recommend a book, and I'm very sorry, but I can't remember the title. In fact, we were all trying to think of the title. It's the author is Eric Foner, Foner, and it's a very recent book, and it talks about how Lincoln's views on African Americans, on slavery and emancipation and equal rights evolved over his lifetime, and especially during the Civil War, as he got to meet more prominent African American leaders. As for the war itself, there's a book by military historian Russell Weigley, who taught at Temple University for many, many years. Russell Weigley, called A Great Civil War, that's a very, very excellent military study of the wars.
There's the book.
Oh, here it is.
The Fiery
The
Trial.
Fiery Trial. The Fiery Trial by Eric Foner.
Wonders of technology. In terms of the books that I would recommend, I mean, in terms of the Lincoln biography, the one that I liked the best was written by David Donald, I think is the author's name. It was probably written maybe in the 60s, but it's excellent. Is it sooner than more recent?
10 years.
Because it really, he tries to write it from the perspective of Lincoln at the time. So again, he's talking about what Lincoln was thinking, what he was feeling as he was taking some of these steps and making some of the speeches. It's an excellent book. In terms of studies of the battles themselves, there's a 3-volume set that is called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. Most of these are newspaper, magazine articles that were written by the generals in the 1880s, 1890s, and so on. So most of them, of course, are trying to justify what they did or what they didn't do and blaming someone else for any defeat. But it is very interesting reading to kind of see what the actual participants thought. A book that I would recommend to everyone who's interested in the Civil War is General Grant's personal memoirs. They are excellent. It is an incredibly well-written book. He finished it just about a week before he died of cancer. And he, of course, knew that was coming. He struggled to get it in because he knew that this book was going to be the foundation of his family's financial well-being. But it's excellent. If any of you want to really delve into the nuances, Shelby Foote's 3-volume set on the Civil War, I think altogether it's probably 2,500 pages, but it's good reading if you want to get into that. And David McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom is also excellent.
Yes.
That's a 1-volume work, and that's probably, I think, it's probably one of the best 1-volume sets you've got.
Yeah.
Real quick.
Team of Rivals.
All right, let's thank our presenters once again. Very nice. And thank the library for doing this. I have a quote for an app that was recommended to me, the history. If you have a tablet or something, an accept application, it is the Civil War Today. It gives you today's headlines, like today is May 28th of 1863. Casualties so far were the North 134,000, South 158,000 as of today. And there are times, but it gives you headlines every day of papers from those years, and that's really a neat app that's put out by the History Channel. Thank you very much for attending. You've been a great audience, great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to absolutely everything. And I'd like to thank again the library for sponsoring this and all the sponsors that made this possible.